Today in Corinne's Picks, we have Don Perlis. Today in Corinne's Picks, we are honored to have Don Perlis, a remarkable artist with museum credits such as the Whitney Museum, Brooklyn Museum. He's in prominent collections internationally. Welcome to Corinne's Picks.
Thank you, Corinne.
You know, a lot of people might not have been around in New York in the 70s and 80s, but you are the quintessential artist when it comes to capturing the grit and the backstory and the underbelly of New York. Tell us a little bit about your art, your career, and basically what you do.
Yes, well, I'm a New York kid. I was born in the Bronx, actually, and when I was younger, I wanted to be a commercial artist because I came from a lower middle class background. I had never been to a museum when I was a child till much later. So the only thing I knew were comic books and commercial illustration. So my initial ambition was to go in that direction, and so I've never actually painted abstractly. I think probably because of that, because I've never given up what I wanted to do when I first started, which is really to represent the world. You know, people around me, people I care about, life around me, my environment, and so I went to New York City schools. I went to an art school in New York. It's called the High School of Art and Design now. In those days, it was called the High School of Industrial Art, and it was mainly there was the High School of Music and Art as well, but the High School of Industrial Art was really more for commercial art than fine art. But nevertheless, they had an illustration course, and I was thrilled to get in there when I was about 14 to get accepted. And you know, learned how to paint and draw. Actually, I did it anyway. I mean, I always drew and painted, but in those days we didn't use oil paint yet. I didn't even know how to use it, or never even saw an oil painting. So we used gouache and watercolor, and mediums actually are much more difficult than oil. And so by the time I learned how to use oil paint, I had already, which was in my mid-20s, I had already had a good 10 years experience using water mediums and things, and I'd never stopped drawing. So
Actually, you know, we're going to look at some of your art in a few minutes, but we're talking about painting and the materials you're using, but a lot of your paintings look like European paintings, like Renaissance paintings.
Yeah.
How did you get that kind of training? How did you get on that level of realism?
Well, when I first started looking at art books, which is I had never seen an oil painting, but I had seen art books of oil paintings actually, and you know, you couldn't help, and nobody could help but being impressed, especially when you're a young kid, of paintings of these great masters like Michelangelo and Leonardo and Rembrandt, Caravaggio, Botticelli. And as a kid, I was blown over by images, and that was what I aspired to. So it gets a little complex because in my education and what I learned later was that modern art, which really began, modernism, which really began in the early part of the 20th century, changed the entire structure of painting, like the spatial structure of it. And the work that I loved, that I loved from when I was younger, and aspired to do, had a different structure than modernist painting. In other words, like I think probably an easy way to describe it would be that most European painting that had its origins really in Greek art, so it's a long time ago, maybe 6,000 years. And we don't even have those works, actually, really, but we do have the Renaissance. But most European painting, the concept of making a painting was looking into a window, you know, where the surface of the picture would be like, if you could imagine a piece of glass, you'd be looking into some space. Whereas modernism had a completely different idea, because they changed the space. They made it much more shallow, and they made the surface of the picture almost be in the same room as the viewer. And it's a completely different idea about picture making. I don't know if that's too esoteric, but you know,
we're kind of talking about very technical things.
Yeah.
And it might be helpful for the audience for me to at least show the first image, Trump World.
Yeah.
And that way you can talk about what you're doing, but you could talk about technique, but also what you're doing in terms of the perspective of context of New York City as well, because you're doing something very social political as well.
Yeah.
So let's look at Trump World and continue to definitely talk about technique and the history of art.
Yeah. You know, there's also something more I'd like to say. You know, there's in traditional European art, there are skills involved that I love, which is drawing skills, making things look real, being able to make things up, being able to make the space up, and that's what I aspired to as a kid. So when I did my New York paintings and everything else later on in my life, I had the same ideas in my mind as I had when I was a kid. You know, so if you want to,
the background of the New York paintings is your love of the classical tradition of Europe, but you're just blending that in a New York City setting.
I'm using, you know, in other words, like a painter who lived in Holland in the 16th century, the way he would look at Amsterdam,
right,
with all this knowledge and love and familiarity is I don't come from Amsterdam, but I do come from here. So my idea was to use everything I knew about painting and about pictures,
right,
and use everything I know, and also keep I was also aspiring to the high level of quality, and I wanted to take all of that and use it in my own environment, in my own work. So I don't know, maybe that's clearer.
Okay.
Yeah,
and definitely, I want to do less talking. I'm hoping as we show the slides that you continue to describe and narrate the context for the audience.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So can we have the first slide, please?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a major work that took several years to paint, and it was a culmination of a lot of work that I had done. And looking at the TV screen, I think the painting might be a little grayer than the bright color that is coming across.
Well, that might just be the monitor.
Could be the monitor.
It's the monitor. Yeah.
It's hard to. Although it looks great, you know. But this is a painting of Times Square, and it came at the end of a whole series of paintings of Times Square. And those paintings came at the end of doing a whole bunch of paintings of New York City that were mostly set on the subway. And I hadn't done a lot of paintings based on contemporary events for a long time previous to the New York City paintings. And I had done other things, like, which we're probably not going to get into too much here, but they were paintings that were based on opera, and different kinds of themes. But the New York City paintings, I started doing them again. I had done a group of New York City paintings in the 80s that had to do with, where I painted a lot of social things that were going on. And I put that aside for about 10, even maybe 20 years, and then went back to it. And so that particular painting, the Trump World, was actually the culmination of all of those New York City paintings that I had begun maybe 5 years ago. So it was a culmination of 2 or 3 different series that I had begun about 5 years ago. And I wanted to get back to painting New York City and painting my environment because it was what I knew, rather than making narrative paintings of other kinds of subjects, mythology, opera, things like that, which I had done for a few years. And I did that in the only way that I knew how to, which was in the most familiar way, which is because I take the subway every day. So I started painting the subway again about 5 or 6 years ago. And it had changed considerably since the 80s, right? Yeah. And there were a lot of street performers, and but it's a cross section of New York life, and something that people could relate to, and I could relate to very easily. So I started doing those things, and I did a whole series of those. And after a while, you do enough of them, you want to come up for air. So I figured I'm going to come up in a very interesting place, and Times Square was an interesting place because what I was looking for was a place that kind of could sum up what life was like in the time we're living in, and Times Square seems to me to be a real symbol of that, in the sense that it's New York, but it's also not New York. It's a cross section of all these tourists that visit New York as well, and it's also an incredible center of commercialization and corporations and TV and theater, and I mean, everything seems to have kind of converged in Times Square. So when I came up out of Times Square, I came up to Times Square from the subways, I was all of a sudden in this incredibly colorful, noisy place that was kind of an epitome of American life, and I didn't really do it consciously. It's just that I wanted to come up in some place that was really interesting, and it was more like instinct. So, and then in confronting it and painting it, it started to reveal itself as what it is, which is really a combination of so many things that clash. People from all over the world, for one thing, people from New York too, and people who work there, and even immigrants who've come there, even illegal immigrants who work, who hustle and work and dress up as superheroes and dress up as Mickey Mouse and Disney characters, and then tourist buses coming through, and people who are even afraid to get out of the tourist buses because they're looking down and they're horrified. It's so scary. And at the same time, they're mingling with people who are coming out of theaters.
So we have 2 minutes until we go to a commercial break.
Yeah.
So in those 2 minutes, can you talk a little bit about that big image of Donald Trump? Because that's a little elephant in the room. And then after the break, we're going to explore some more images.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, that painting, being it's a culmination of everything I'm talking about, was because I started putting Trump's head into the paintings as a huge kind of blown up head like Big Bird, because he started campaigning, and he himself is such a caricature with his colored hair and all that, and and it's almost like he can almost be a cartoon character. So I put him in there almost as a joke, but then the campaign started getting serious, and all of a sudden, it looked like he was going to be elected. So it was imminent. So I wasn't thinking about it. So I thought, wow. I'll make Uncle Sam marching. I designed the whole painting of Times Square, and then it had no center. It had no. It was just a summation of all the Times Square paintings that I had made, tourists and everything like that. And it needed a center, so it was just such a natural thing. I thought, well, why don't I have? Because the presidential campaign is started. Why don't I have Uncle Sam coming into the middle of the painting, carrying these 2 big balloons, with a big head of Donald Trump, because all of a sudden, the entire Times Square area seemed like it was an epitome, like a representation of everything he stood for. It just came together. It wasn't even something that was preconceived. It just happened, and basically, so I made all these little paintings, and then I thought of the idea of putting the Uncle Sam in with the balloons of Times Square, and then all of a sudden the painting started to make sense. And so I decided to make it a large painting and have it sum up of all the paintings I had done the previous 5 years.
Okay, we're going to go to break now. When we come back, we can continue talking about that Trump world paintings.
Okay.
See you in a few.
Yeah.
So when we left, we were talking about Trump World, that painting.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next painting, and maybe you can continue to describe some of the content of the painting: Big Bird, Trump,
Sure.
Elmo.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, here's the next one.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is interesting because if you look at the Trump World painting, there's interactions between the people that work there. On the lower left-hand side, when I was doing this painting, I didn't have the Trump World painting yet in my mind at the time, but I was working with the idea of having the workers interact when they're out of their costumes and on a break, so some of the workers are women who paint their breasts and paint their bodies and pose for tourists, pose with tourists and try to get tips from the tourists for photographs. And then some of the other people who work there dress up in Elmo costumes, Batman, superhero costumes, and they work together. So they interact, they know each other, they take lunch, they take breaks. If you go to Times Square, you'll see some of them sitting around having coffee without their costumes on. So basically, I did make a whole bunch of pictures about these people after hours. So it's at nighttime. The cop is walking by on the left. One of the women are joking with and being flirtatious with the men, and now there's a lot of European paintings that have mythological content, where there's interactions between they're very erotic.
With Zeus seducing the
right,
maiden.
like we were speaking about the other day, but also,
the swan.
and there's satyrs,
Right.
seducing nymphs.
Right.
And a nymph is not a nymphomaniac. It's a nymph nymph is a forest goddess, right? Although the word is Pan is the Pan would be the
Half
satyr,
god.
it'd be the satyr, and those I always love the content of those paintings because there's such a wonderful play between the half animal male and then the goddess, right? So that particular painting is kind of it relates to European painting, but it also, the theme is universal. It's never gone away.
But
So-
Mickey Mouse is kind of perverse because
Yeah.
he's like a trusted children's image, you know,
Yeah,
and he's
yeah.
there with this sexy, you know,
Yeah.
sexy Amazon kind of.
Yeah, well, that's the other part that we haven't talked about, which is where I'm having fun with a lot of the contemporary, a lot of the contemporary meanings. I mean, when they're juxtaposed, you know, representational work hasn't really been done on a major scale for a long, long time, and the opportunity to bring it back on a major scale and to address some of these themes. There's a lot of funny juxtapositions and things that happen when you start to do that. You start mixing contemporary subject matter with ancient human themes of lust, and but the name of that painting is Lust, and which was actually a name that came after the painting was finished. But basically, what I wanted to do is to show a scene of flirtation, and so, and then it is a little perverse, and it's deliberately perverse, and even and if you see the actual painting, you'll see that the models are actually even wearing wigs, which is, it's not so evident when you see a small reproduction, because I don't want to, I want to make these people look like what they are, which is real human beings underneath, dressed up like this in order to be able to make a living, and that's, so there's a lot of levels, you know, actually.
Okay, so let's
Yeah.
get into the next image.
Okay, sure. Oh yes, yeah, yeah. I call this painting Innocence, and you know, even though you know, even though it's a kind of sexy image, but the nudity itself is innocent. I mean, nudity is innocent. I mean, when you're born naked, you die naked. At the same time, it also has this connotation of these women who are actually using their nudity to make money, and so there's a lot of play with the meanings. It's, I mean, you know, it could, but I don't see any reason why a painting can't have 4 or 5 meanings at the same time, because it's all in the mind of the beholder.
Yeah, it's not unlike a classic nude. I mean, the thong makes it something else, I think. The thong is a highly erotic, you know, strip club.
Yeah.
It's it's sexual in a different way than just the typical artistic model.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's true. So it has that meaning as well, but it also could have the other. And then, and in terms of innocence, so say if you could make up a narrative about this painting. I mean, you'd say, all right, so here's this young woman who's never done this before, and she gets initiated into, all of a sudden she's got to paint herself and wear thong, and then she's got to walk into this environment, right? And then you've got the painting then you've got this classic theme of Dante and Virgil going through the levels of hell, right? And then there's paintings that Botticelli made in the Renaissance, where Botticelli is accompanying Dante and Virgil's, and they're going on they're looking at the damned in different levels of hell. So here you've got a Batman, and you've got a Spider-Man, and they're taking this young woman and they're showing her Times Square, which is kind of another take on hell,
Right.
right? It could be wonderful.
But you have the Google sign above them too.
Right, which is another. So there's all these different levels of meaning that and at the same time, I can make a painting that has beautiful color, and that has light, and that has space, and I've got Mickey Mouse in the back. I've got a cop in the back. I've even got a tourist talking to the cop, and there's all these levels that I can play with, and it's all visual and it's all contemporary. At the same time, it's not contemporary. At the same time, it's ancient. So I mean, I can have all of that. So I paint abstractly, and I've got nothing against abstract painting. Of course, these are beautiful paintings behind us. I've got nothing at all against abstract painting, but I can have all of these levels in my work, and it keeps me going. You know,
But I mean, anybody who knows Don Perlis and your work, basically, you have chronicled what you're doing is really important. It's not only abstract necessarily; it doesn't chronicle New York City. I mean,
Yeah.
you're almost like a historian.
Yeah, I
in
want
some
to talk
ways.
about I want to talk about how it feels like, what it feels like to be alive now in this environment. I want people to be able to look at my work 100 years from now, and get us the way we can look at Toulouse-Lautrec in Paris, or Jan Steen in Amsterdam, or Rembrandt, and then or Vermeer, and or or Leonardo, and say, well, this is the way it felt to be in Rome or Florence in that time. This is the way it felt to be like in Amsterdam. This is the way it felt to be in Paris, and this is the way it must have felt to be in New York 100 years before, in 2000 or whatever, 2001 or whatever.
So we have
Yeah.
3 minutes left of the show. Unfortunately, we've only done two images. I'm hoping to do at least one more image.
Sure. Sure.
There's definitely going to be a part 2 to this
Yeah,
episode.
yeah.
So we can explore in part 2 the rest. But at least let's get to at least one more.
Of course.
And then
Sure,
before the end of the show,
Sure.
we have like 2 minutes.
Sure. Oh yes. Yeah. Oh yes. This painting was done after Trump got elected. But before anybody knew how controversial he always was controversial. But it seems that when he first got elected, he jacked it up even more, the controversy. So all of a sudden, it made people go at each other's throats, and there was a general air of hostility that was in the country. It's even more accelerated now. It's actually gone way past where it was when I made this painting, and so what I've got is two Wonder Women having a fight over what ostensibly looks like a card game, with Donald Trump in the background on a big TV screen in that area that's actually a part of Times Square where the big American flag is, with tourists looking behind, horrified by the hostility. And the hostility is coming from behind them, it's coming from them, and it's a general air of anger that's pervasive, that's actually taken over the entire country since his inauguration. And this painting is about that. So it documents that. It documents the emotional truth of that.
So
Yeah.
we've run out of time. It's an honor to have you on my show.
Oh, thank you.
I really am admirer of your work, and hopefully we'll do this in another episode.
Sure.
So thank
I'd
you.
be delighted to come back.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you,
All right.
Corinne.
All right.
Thank you.